Good morning. I'm Todd Snyder in the music department here at the college. Welcome to the Popcorn Forum. Today's topic is the world of today, and what better way to celebrate it than jazz and young people. I wanted to thank the three individuals here by the name of Any Suggestions. That's their name, Any Suggestion. And they actually are available for more performances, so if you're interested, they are putting money together to go on tour 1 year from now to Scandinavia, Norway, and Sweden. So they're looking for many opportunities to play. Please join me in thanking Mickey on drums, Mickey Taylor, and Ryan Crandall on bass, and Kyle Kelly on piano.
What a wonderful way to start our program today, as each day we have started with live music to put us in a certain frame of mind for that program. I apologize for my voice, but the week has done me in. We're so delighted to invite you to the fifth and final day of the 29th Annual Popcorn Forum Convocation Series. And this year we have again had a journey through time, and we have looked at what happened in the Western world in the second millennium. What a way and special treat to conclude today. We have a keynote speaker that will absolutely inform you in a way that is rare for one to get such great knowledge from one person. Following his keynote address, we will have a roundtable discussion at 1 o'clock in this room, and again this evening at 7 p.m. Let me just for a moment tell you how that is different from past years. Usually the fifth day is on a specific subtopic, and we have a panel only from that day. Our keynote speaker this morning will be the moderator at 1 and at 7, and we're inviting back from the first 4 days the panelists from all those different areas of economics and science and from philosophy and religion and art to meet with our scholar to have a roundtable discussion of all of those issues over the last 1,000 years, and for you to participate. He is a master at such moderation of such a subject, and I hope you will be here for those 2 times. But let us get to the keynote address. Dr. Clay Jenkins is one of the founders of the modern Chautauqua movement in this country. He is thought of as the greatest Chautauqua performer in this country. He does such characters as Meriwether Lewis, Thomas Jefferson, John Calvin, and John Wesley Powell. But he's not here today to perform as a character, but as a scholar, Dr. Clay Jenkinson. His credentials so justify that presentation. In 1988, he was awarded the Kansas Humanities Scholar of the Year Award, and in 1989, President George Bush presented our guest speaker with the Charles Frankel Prize, which is the most prestigious award given by the National Endowment for the Humanities. And may I pause to say, we also thank the Idaho Humanities Council for giving us a grant, as they have done for the past 4 years for this series. In 1994, Dr. Jenkinson portrayed Jefferson for President and Mrs. Clinton and 275 others at the State Department in Washington, D.C. He received a degree in English from the University of Minnesota and was selected for that very prestigious honor to be a Rhodes Scholar at Oxford University, where he received a degree in Renaissance English, literature, and theology. What is so wonderful about our speaker, he has to turn down half of the invitation he gets, but he says, every year I'll be at North Idaho College if you want me, and I know you do. And to speak today as our man in residence, the most Renaissance person that I have ever met, and to speak about where are we now after the second millennium, give a really Idaho welcome to Dr. Clay Jenkinson.
Good morning, everyone. Let me say, first of all, that I do very much like to come to Coeur d'Alene, partly because this college I think, has more real intellectual energy than most of the four-year institutions that I visit, partly because this is one of the most beautiful places on earth, partly because I'm interested in the journey of Lewis and Clark, and of course they passed through this part of the world twice, in 1805 and 1806, and partly, frankly, because of Tony Stewart. I think the ideal, this is one of the themes that I'm going to try to come back to towards the end of my talk this morning. The ideal is somehow in the 21st century for our work to be deeply pleasurable and for our deep pleasures to be productive in just the right way. And I work with literally hundreds of organizers of chautauquas and lecture series and festivities and so on around the country. And there's no one that I feel more affinity with than Tony Stewart. He's done extraordinary things for this community and this college, and you have a hero in your midst. And if there were no other reason to come back, and there are plenty, I would always come back because Tony Stewart is involved. So thank you, Tony, as usual. If I were a Homeric bard, which I'm not, I would invoke the muses at this point and ask for help, because I've chosen a very difficult subject here, some kind of retrospective on the millennium. This is an impossible task for a scholar much more capable than I am. So let me invoke my muse and try to bring that energy into me. In the Homeric world, people who gave public presentations never presumed that they had any inherent excellence. They always assumed that whatever they were doing was being channeled through the cosmos, and they were just the mouthpiece of it. And I want to say that for two reasons. One is I don't think that I'm up to this all by myself, and secondly, if anything wrong comes out of my mouth, I can now distance myself from it. Let me get started by saying a few words about the era in which we live. I'm going to concentrate to a certain extent on the 20th century because that makes it a little bit easier, and also, as you probably know, Tony Stewart is already planning next year's Popcorn Forum, and it will be a retrospective on the 20th century. So this, in a way, is the last lecture of this series and the opening of next year's forum, which will be in March of the year 2000, the millennial year. But when I was thinking about this the other day, Dickens came to mind. If you think about the 20th century, it was the best of times, it was the worst of times. It was the age of wisdom. It was the age of foolishness. It was the epoch of belief. It was the epoch of incredulity. It was the season of light. It was the season of darkness. It was the spring of hope. It was the winter of despair. We had everything before us. We had nothing before us. We were all going direct to heaven. We were all going direct the other way. That's the opening of A Tale of Two Cities, the most famous paragraph in all of Charles Dickens, and it seems to me it reflects well on the paradox of the 20th century. Let me give you some bits. I have a friend who is a photographer in Colorado. He is a very fine photographer, invited to all of the best festivities that occur in Denver, which is one of the world's most prosperous cities. He happens to be African American. And when he goes to cash his check that we give him from the Colorado Endowment for the Humanities, at a bank that he has banked at for the last 15 years, about 1 out of 3 times he is challenged and his check is not routinely cashed. And before they cash his check, they call the office of the Colorado Endowment for the Humanities to see whether he's okay. Now, if he were white, they would cash his check. He's been for 15 years at the same bank, and because he's an African American, his money is in some sense suspect in that bank. Do we have work to do as we enter the 21st century? Imagine it. Imagine your self-esteem, your confidence, your faith in this system. If you are African American, accidentally born black, and you are a high professional of excellence and responsibility, and you cannot cash a check in a bank in Denver, Colorado. and yet that story is repeated 100 times a day. Gary Wills, the great classicist and Jefferson scholar, in an article in the New York Review of Books about 6 months ago, said, with a little exaggeration, the lives of women have changed more in the last 30 years than they have changed in the last 3,000 years. I don't quite agree with that, but I think he's certainly on to an essential point, that the revolution has really come for women in a way that it has not for other minorities. The lives of women have changed more in the last 30 years than in the last 3,000. And yet, one can think of innumerable examples of how this is not so. One of my dearest friends was being stalked by a very dangerous man. And when she went to the local judicial system to file her complaint, she was treated like someone from the Jerry Springer show, as white trailer trash. And the bureaucrats, who were women, middle-aged women, offended her in every possible way by presuming that she must have asked for whatever it was that was happening in her life. The lives of women have changed more in 30 years than in the last 3,000, and yet, in certain regards, we're still operating by patriarchal norms that are 5,000, 10,000 years old. That sort of thing has to stop. I was at the Mayo Clinic to give a talk a year or so ago, and my host took me into their specimen laboratory. They get 100,000 specimens a day from around the world, from Asia, from Africa, from Antarctica, from all over the known world. They come by FedEx, they come by UPS, they come by every courier service. Some people, like the King of Jordan, send them on a jet, a specimen of urine from Jordan to Rochester, Minnesota. Now, specimens are always time sensitive, and so the Mayo Clinic has worked out a barcode system. The moment a specimen arrives in the mail, it is unpacked, it is assigned a barcode, and a computerized system follows that specimen through its miles and miles and miles of laboratory corridors, so that every specimen is tracked and every one is checked out, is analyzed according to its time sensitivity. And he said, this is only the beginning. This is the first round, the pitiful first round of the tracking system that we're developing. He said within a year or two, every specimen will be assigned a little computer chip, and it will be tracked not by barcodes, it'll be tracked by satellite systems, and we will be able to know, and so will the patient in Jordan or in Cambodia or in South Africa know where that specimen is, at what level it's being evaluated. The evaluation might come to this person by the internet. It may not come through the voice of a doctor or a technician at all. We're just beginning that revolution. And yet, in the United States, 40% of 266 million people are without health insurance. Think of that. What's 40% of 266 million people? That's over 115 million people are without effective health insurance at the same time that we can micromanage the urine of a wealthy person from Cambodia. There's something wrong in this picture, that we are developing systems that sophisticated, that intricate, that sensitive, and yet in gross respects there is fundamental inequality in the delivery of health care to the American people. And when you think of the American people, think of a people almost infinitely better off than the rest. The Portuguese, Tanzanians, people from Paraguay. Smallpox, at the beginning of the century, was one of the great plagues of the world. Now it is entirely eradicated. In fact, there was a learned debate amongst biologists a couple of years ago about whether the last petri dish of smallpox should be snuffed out. They had gotten it down. Think of it. At one time, it ravaged millions of people, tens of millions. And now, thanks to science, it has been reduced and shrunken until all of smallpox, so far as we know, now exists in a single petri dish. That is a breathtaking monument to this century. And they debated whether they should snuff it out, get rid of it once for all, or keep it because as a curiosity, or because maybe it's important in the biodiversity of the universe, so that maybe it's worth keeping even though we don't quite know why. Think of that. That is in itself a symbol of this century, a symbol of the Enlightenment. And yet, on our computer systems, we now have computer viruses. Think of humanity, what a pathetic creature we are. Having gotten rid of typhoid and gotten rid of smallpox, now we introduce viruses into the electronic world. We disease our electronic space. For what reason? For play, for terrorism, who knows what. But we have created the pathology of the electronic world to compensate for the dwindling pathology of the biological world. Someone like John Donne, my poet, or Shakespeare would find that extremely interesting, that humans have such a dark side that they need to recapitulate it in neutral electronic space. And when they catch the man who launched Melissa, the relatively harmless computer virus, a few weeks ago, he had nothing to say, just for fun, that he disrupted billions of bits of data. Or how about this? In this century, we've killed by assassination 2 Kennedys. John Fitzgerald Kennedy on the 22nd of November 1963, and his brother Robert Kennedy in 1968 in June. 2 of the greatest cataclysms in the Commonwealth of our time. And yet we have a musical group called the Dead Kennedys. What would Thomas Jefferson think of the idea of such vulgarity in the popular culture that you can parody the death of 2 extraordinary gifted leaders? Somehow civility has plummeted almost to zero in a culture that can have a band that flourishes called the Dead Kennedys. And yet, we all sort of shrug our shoulders, and it doesn't seem particularly outrageous. I was in a Kmart not so long ago, and I saw 2 women in their 70s. They're walking along in the garden section, and one of the women was complaining about weeds in her garden. And she said, "Oh, I have dandelions up the wazoo." I thought, do you know what you're saying here? I mean, have you thought this through? Are these metaphors that we use? My grandmother wouldn't say up the wazoo. She would die before she said something like that. And yet, the common culture has just collapsed until anything goes. And people don't even know how vulgar they're being. She would be shocked if I'd stopped and explained it to her. She probably would have slapped me or slapped a lawsuit on me. It was the best of times and the worst of times. I read the other day that we now have 1.8 million Americans in prison. 1.8 million Americans are in prison. The largest percentage of our population in the history of America is in prison. Most of them are black. The rest, who aren't black, are drug users or drug salesmen. 1.8 million out of a population of 266 million. No other country, not South Africa, has that percentage of its people in prison. And yet when the president goes before Congress and gives the State of the Union message, he says, the State of the Union is good, and he gets a standing ovation. In what sense can it be said that the State of the Union is good when almost 2 million people are in prison, and most of them are there because they are people of color? And yet, we go on, the stock market bursts through 10,000, and we celebrate. Well, you get the point, that this is a culture with deep paradoxes at its very center. It is the best of times, and it is the worst of times. But think of the glories of the 20th century for just a moment. Life expectancy. I read Carl Sagan's book, Billions and Billions, the last of his books, a very beautiful book about love, among other things. And in it he said, in the United States, between the year 1900 and the year 1999, life expectancy has almost doubled. It was 40-some years at the beginning of the century, and it is at about 80 at the end of the century. That's, again, a breathtaking statistic about progress. We've doubled the length of life. The fundamental issue, death, has been set back for the haves of the world in a way that no one could have dreamed of at the beginning of the century. And maybe we're only beginning. Maybe we'll live to be 150 or 200. We'll be like Swift's Struldbrugs by the end of the 21st century. Think of the 2 most beautiful, and to my mind, the 2 most beautiful photographs of the 20th century. One I'll bet all of you remember this one. One was the photograph of the Earthrise from the moon in 1968. Remember that photograph of the pale, lifeless satellite moon, and then above it you see a kind of two-thirds Earth rising above the moon's horizon? What could be more extraordinary than that? Not only did we leave the planet Earth in the 20th century for the first time and send probes, dozens of them, to the far corners of the solar system, but we actually took human beings and set them on the moon, and then they took photographs back at us. We finally got mirrored in the profoundest of all possible ways. Well, the second one, I mentioned this the other night, I find this even more amazing. A couple of years ago, they pointed the Hubble telescope at an empty place in the sky, the emptiest place they could think of. That was the project. Let's see where we can find nothing and point Hubble and take a picture, and they did. And the picture was reprinted in National Geographic in a big spread, a centerfold of the right kind. And when you look at it, it is solar system followed by cosmos, followed by universe, followed by nebulae, followed by solar system, followed by Milky Way. In every direction, even the empty quarters of space are filled. Hundreds of billions of stars, hundreds of billions of galaxies. And now there's talk of billions of universes. In the 20th century, we've simply exploded the concept of the universe until most people are bewildered. But certainly whatever pretensions humankind had in 1500, in the middle of the millennium, those pretensions have been radically adjusted by the end of this millennium, and we're only beginning. Think of what's happened. Most of the things that you and I take for granted are of the 20th century. Automobiles, produced right on the beginning of the century. Airplanes, entirely within this century. Rocketry, entirely within this century. Air conditioners, refrigerators, recording of music, recording of voice, CD players, tape recorders, the whole world of recording sound, 20th century. Movies, 20th century. Computers, of course. Telephones, late 19th century. Industrialized medicine. Now, the latest trend in medicine is specific drugs, so that if I need insulin for my form of diabetes, within a few years, as long as I'm one of the haves with health insurance, I will get DNA-specific insulin that takes care of my problem but doesn't exacerbate my other difficulty, which may be kidney failure. And your insulin will take care of your problem but not exacerbate your other issue, which is high blood pressure. So we're now going to have designer-specific, individualized drugs for the haves. But meanwhile, AIDS will sweep off most of Africa because that's the have-nots. Amazing. The internet, penicillin. I was asked the most interesting question that I was ever asked as Thomas Jefferson in New Hampshire a year or so ago. I was giving a talk at a small school of fifth graders, and after talking and taking questions for about an hour, this young woman raised her hand and she said, "Mr. Jefferson, now that you have had a chance to visit our world, what would you like to take back with you to the 18th century?" What an extraordinary question. She could not have asked that of me if I'd been a scholar. She could only have asked that of me because I was pretending to be Thomas Jefferson. Since I was pretending to be Jefferson, she was pretending to be somebody asking this question of Jefferson. So there was a kind of wonderful dynamic that occurred that couldn't have occurred in any other way. Well, I'd never been asked this question, what would you like to take back with you? And I had to think about it. So I thought for a while, and I finally said penicillin. Jefferson had 6 children, 5 died of diseases that would have been cured by antibiotics. Amazing. The breakthroughs in science at every level in medicine. So when you look at Tony's grid here, the world of science and technology, you have to say this is the best of times, if you have access to it. If you don't have access to it, then it has to be the worst of times, because in our global village, we all know too much. The people who are dying because we can't barcode their drugs in Rwanda are watching CNN dispatches on their local televisions of the breakthroughs at the Mayo Clinic. So the world is all woven together, and we all know what everyone else is doing. The first world ignores the second and third worlds, but the third world watches our sports, watches our Academy Awards, watches our science, watches all that we do. That has to be galling that they see that all of this is available and the only problem is distribution. So that's the theme that I want to enforce this morning. The issue, it seems to me, of the 21st century is an issue of distribution. And the question is, can we, as a people, as a commonwealth, let's just stay within America for the moment, can we distribute the fruits of life, good food, good medicine, good shelter, good education, good health care, can we distribute the fruits of life in some just way so that every person, and especially every willing and able-bodied person, that is, person willing to work, willing to, as President Clinton once put it, play by the rules, work hard. Everyone who's willing to earn the fruits of life, can we make sure that everyone in that category does get some of the fruits of life? You would think this problem would have been solved. This would seem to be one of the fundamental problems of civilization. And yet at the end of the 20th century, we're backing away from a notion that everyone has an inherent right to some of the fruits of life. We've become mean-spirited in our politics, and our view now is unless you happen to get it somehow, you probably don't deserve it. But Jefferson wouldn't say that, and Eleanor Roosevelt wouldn't say that, and even Theodore Roosevelt wouldn't say that. And John Locke went farther than all of them and said every human being by accident of birth has a right to the fruits of life if he's willing to work for it. I heard the other day that Americans, this was on a political commentary, that Americans are not particularly good at critiquing their system of distribution. There's an understatement. Europeans are much more willing to critique their system of distribution. Americans assume that Adam Smith was right, that there's an invisible hand sorting all of this out, and if you live in a trailer in East Helena, Montana, you probably deserve to. I was recently in Helena, Montana, and I went to do a photo essay for an essay that I'm writing on East Helena. And I went with a certain kind of smugness, because it was meant to be a kind of a lighthearted essay about how East Helena is more raw and less pretty and less polished than Helena. Not that Helena is Paris. And so I went with my two friends, one of whom was a photographer, and when we got to East Helena, we began to tour the districts of East Helena, and I'll tell you, I fell into an incredibly deep depression because, first of all, the photographer, my friend who's about 60, told me that the average family income in Montana now is the lowest in the country. It's $17,500 for a family of four. Think of that. And we saw people living, good, nice, law-abiding, God-fearing people living in conditions that I would not want to live in for one day. And they did it, why? Not because they're bad, but because that's where they are. When President Clinton says the State of the Union is good, one wonders if he's been on the Pine Ridge Indian Reservation lately. I'm from North Dakota. You can drive from the first world into the third world in an automobile in 15 minutes in North Dakota. And when you get to that third world, say the Standing Rock Indian Reservation, you find fetal alcohol syndrome, widespread alcoholism, widespread drug abuse, the highest domestic incidence of AIDS in America, hepatitis, unemployment running to 90%, people living in housing that we would condemn in any suburb in America. And yet there is a widespread apathy about all of this. So the question of the next century, I think, is a moral question. Can we find a way to create a system of politics and distribution that is more basically equitable and that distributes more according to dignity rather than what we take to be merit and industry? I don't think we know the answer to that, but if that's a particular problem in America, think of what it is between America and the rest of the world. Carl Sagan says in his book Billions and Billions, we now are 4% of the world's population and we consume 34% of the world's resources. And so there's a growing north-south issue. The first world, France, Britain, Germany, Japan, Korea, the United States, and so on, is consuming most of the world's resources. The second and third world consuming almost none. And the planet can't take much more of our consumption at the same time that all of those other peoples with their CNN and their awakeness to the global village want the same things that we have. And yet no one is particularly trying to puzzle out how this is all going to take place without killing the planet. Then think of another approach entirely, leaving that aside for the moment. Thomas Jefferson's dream of America. Thomas Jefferson's dream of America was that you would be living alone on a piece of land with your family, and that you would understand the basic economy. That is, you would feed yourself, and you would clothe yourself to a certain degree, and you would shelter yourself. You would be self-sufficient, and you wouldn't depend upon any grid. There would be no supply system beyond your control. And he said, the ideal American is a person who will be self-sufficient, but who will be enlightened at the same time. And so the way he put it, which always sounds comic to us, is that his ideal citizen would be a farmer who subsists in the fields by day and reads Homer in the original Greek at night. And it's a glorious vision. When I say it, both in or out of my character, people laugh, and of course it is delightful. It's comic in a certain way, but it's also extraordinarily beautiful because it's what Jefferson had in mind. What he had in mind were two things: that we would be a people who didn't require systems beyond our control, that we would be the first people in human history that were capable of living as complete, self-governing, self-regulating, self-supplying human beings. And in his time, 97% of us were farmers, and they were. My grandparents, who lived on a dairy farm in Minnesota, were self-supplying. I believe the largest income they ever had in their whole lives, they died in the 80s, their largest income was $12,000, and yet they lived beautifully. They grew their own food. My grandmother had a garden of about half an acre. She canned 500 quarts a year. They butchered their own cattle. They didn't exactly mill their own wheat, but they grew wheat and had it milled. And they were self-sufficient, and they are only separated from me by 15 years, and yet I am utterly dependent upon systems that I cannot control and do not understand. I always think of the decline of America in my own family. My grandparents were self-sufficient dairy farmers in Minnesota. My father was a banker and my mother was a school teacher, and I'm a guy who dresses up like a dead man. What a decline of basic virtue has occurred here. You know, we've gone from productivity to decadence in 1 century. Imagine it. I mean, if you told Thomas Jefferson, what if a guy could spend a lot of his life dressing up like a dead man and get away with it? Jefferson would say, what possible decadence could have occurred that would have enabled this to be possible? There must be some benighted Tony Stewart somewhere who would bring him to talk. So Jefferson wanted us to be first self-sufficient. Now, maybe we cannot be self-sufficient in the profoundest sense in our time, but he would want us to be self-sufficient in some sense of the term. Are we? Maybe some of you are. But think of the second element to this. The second element is that he would want us to know how our world works. If you can't control your whole universe, then you at least should know how it works so that you're aware of the power relationships. Are we? Do we know where our power comes from? Do we know where our food comes from? Do we know where our supplies come from, our transport, our fuel, our basic subsistence? I don't. What if you had to explain your world? What if a Martian dropped into your house tonight and said, explain a computer chip, since you depend upon it? Or explain credit, banking. Explain how a credit card works. Could we explain it? I couldn't. A few could. But Jefferson wanted us, first of all, to control our destiny, and second of all, to understand the world that we lived in. And now it's beyond our control. And if you think of the Y2K problem, think of what we're up against. We have a money system that is now almost entirely electronic. And then we have a credit system and a stock exchange system which is even more abstract and electronic. And everything that matters, from the distribution of bread and sausage to air traffic control to the distribution of power into your house to the fuel oil that you put into your furnace system, all of this is now distributed by electronic means. And so we've built a digital house of cards as high as Babel, which we don't understand, and if it collapses, nobody knows what happens. People are storing up food. If you listen to sort of evangelical radio, you can, for $1,500, buy a year's supply of macaroni and put it in your closet. And people are doing it because they're frightened that Y2K is real. I'm hoping that it is true. I'm hoping there will be some collapse, because and somehow it will remind us of the Jeffersonian fundament of life if the whole electronic infrastructure collapses, at least for a day. And people have to think, what would I do then if the bread stopped coming into the grocery store? What would I do if the light didn't turn on when I flicked the switch? Think of how much our expectations have changed. When I first had a modem for my computer, I thought it was a miracle. Now I'm offended if it takes 4 seconds for my internet search to come up. I think, what kind of a world do I live in where this isn't instantaneous? Think of the way the expectations just change immediately. So Jefferson would say you first of all have to control your subsistence, and second of all, you at least have to understand it. And then the third element, the hard one, where America has done poorest, Jefferson wants you to be reading your Homer in Greek at night. Now, this isn't about classical Greek, but he wants you to be spending your leisure in soul development. Do the Americans, the 266 million Americans, spend their leisure in soul development? Not to my knowledge. What's the largest growth industry on television besides Jerry Springer? Professional wrestling. There's a proliferation. There are like 8 rival squads now that travel around the world. Stone Cold Steve Austin is a household name throughout America. We are not a people who is doing soul work in our leisure. Most families have a television set. It's flicked on from the moment people rise until the moment the last person collapses. And if your television is flicked on for that entire period, what it means essentially is this, that your discretionary time is being consumed by Jenny Jones, or maybe at your best, Law and Order, or Ally McBeal, or whatever her name is. Think of that. Jefferson wanted you to be learning a language, gardening, grafting a tree, designing your dream house, writing a letter to a friend in Austria, inventing something. And instead, look what we've done. And so here's the second question. If the first question that I want to leave with you today is, how are we going to distribute the fruits of life in the next century, even within America, even within Idaho? The second question is, how are we ever going to turn from getting and spending into soul work? There's a great poem by Wordsworth, which I'll just quickly recite to you. It's a sonnet about this very issue, about how the Western world stopped doing soul work and started just getting and spending. And this is what he says. The world is too much with us. Late and soon, getting and spending, we lay waste our powers. Little there is in nature that is ours. We have given our hearts away, a sordid boon. This sea that bears its bosom to the moon, these winds that will be howling at all hours and are upgathered now like sleeping flowers. For this, for everything, we are out of tune. It moves us not. Great God, I'd rather be a pagan suckled in a creed outworn, so might I, standing on this pleasant lea, have glimpses that would make me less forlorn, have sight of Proteus rising from the sea, or hear old Triton blow his wreathed horn. In other words, what Wordsworth was demanding is that we stop filling our space with stuff and hearken back to a world that was enchanted in some way. And so the project that Wordsworth and other poets have been talking about is the re-enchantment of the world, or the turning from materialism into soul development. I see this as the project of the next century. How much is enough? How much is enough? How many, when I was born in North Dakota, people were lucky to have a garage. Then when I was in my teenage years, if you were wealthy, you had a 2-car garage. Now if you have a 2-car garage, you're considered to be insufficiently prosperous. And so we go on and on. And think of where this stuff comes from. You know, slavery and Jefferson are such a big issue. Thomas Jefferson is rapidly becoming the poster child for the unresolved race issues in American history, and we beat up on people like Jefferson for owning slaves and perpetuating slavery and for being racists. We've heard from Abraham Lincoln over the last couple of days that the proudest moment in the history of America, perhaps the proudest moment in the history of Western civilization, is the abolition of slavery, the Emancipation Proclamation. And undoubtedly he meant the follow-through by way of the civil rights legislation of the 1940s, 50s, and 60s. But is it so, really? When you go into a Walmart and buy a pair of tennis shoes or a golf shirt, do you know how that was produced? I know a little bit about this because last year I was invited to go out and speak in the Mariana Islands, which are next to Guam, part of the American Commonwealth. And on the Mariana Islands, there is semi-slave labor. Chinese workers are hustled by what can only be called procurers who go over there. They hire a dozen, 2 dozen, 100 teenage or young adult Chinese laborers who are desperately poor, and they bring them in special boats or special planes to the Mariana Islands, where they live in locked dormitories and where they work 10, 15, 20 hours a day for $2 or $3 to produce golf shirts that sell at resorts of the kind that I'm enjoying staying at here in Coeur d'Alene. So when I walk in and put down my entirely electronic credit card to buy a golf shirt in Coeur d'Alene and take it back for my father as a gift, I never think, I wonder under what conditions that shirt was made. I might look at the label to see whether it says made in America, and indeed it does, because the Mariana Islands, as a Commonwealth of America, are permitted by law to put made in America on all of their products, and yet if that's not slave labor, I don't know what is. And so what we've done in the first world is export slavery to the third world to cheer ourselves up. But that doesn't mean it doesn't still exist. It's just gone beyond our borders. We may be able to protect ourselves from slave labor in Idaho, but we aren't protecting ourselves from it in the rest of the world that supplies the very stuff that we have to have. But this is the way we've abstracted ourselves so that we can feel better about our lives. What will they say of us in the year 3000? I don't know, but one of the issues that they surely will raise is how we produced veal, how we produced beef, how we produced chicken, how we produced turkey in the late 20th century. And yet somehow we've distanced ourselves from all of this. And one reason that we've done it, or one way that we've done it, is to become so obsessive about getting and spending, and so obsessive about our escapes, chiefly television, and so obsessive about our drugs from Prozac on the one end to gin on the other, that we aren't awake any longer. And so if there were a true spiritual leader who came to see us, and instead of giving the State of America, State of the Union message before Congress, gave the state of American civilization message and told the truth instead of political lies, what do you suppose that person would say? I doubt that that being would say, "You've never had it so good." I feel certain that being would say, even if this system can be said to work, and even if this system can be said to be just and fair and equitable, which it cannot, you are pursuing getting and spending to the almost entire neglect of the life of the spirit and the life of the soul, and that's not why humanity was implanted here. Let me give you quickly a line from Shakespeare. I want to wind down here and close on a more positive note. But Shakespeare talks about, in Hamlet, there's a discussion about what a complete man is, and Hamlet says, "What is a man if the chief work and market of his time is but to sleep and feed, a beast no more? Surely the God that made us and put into us such godlike discourse intended that sacred reason to be used and not to fuss in us unused." Well, I think we've allowed ourselves to fuss, great verb, and we have to stop fussing in the next century. And so you have to say, how much is enough? So I want to close, and if there's time, and Tony will let me know, I'll take some questions or comments. Surely some of the things I've said you don't agree with, some of you, but I was asked to come and try to put this century into some kind of retrospect. I'm glad to be alive now. I wouldn't want to be alive in any other time. Sometimes I dream, if I could snap my fingers and be alive at another time, when would it be? I suppose all of us do this, and when I do, I often think I would love to have been in Idaho and Montana in 1804 when Lewis and Clark arrived. when there were millions of buffalo in every direction, and when there were grizzly bears all over this region, and when the native peoples were still thriving, and when the rivers were clean, and when the sky was completely clear, and elk were just dancing all over the plains, and the grass had not yet been plowed. Wouldn't it have been extraordinary to be here then? And then I wake up and realize if I'd been alive in 1804, I wouldn't have been with Lewis and Clark. I would have been a librarian in Boston. You know, I'm not the kind of person who would have been an adventurer. I would have been some nerd somewhere dreaming of the very same thing. But it seems to me that in the next century we need to dream more, and we need to try to return the world to a more enchanted, more soulful, more place, and we shouldn't apologize for that. We shouldn't feel that that's somehow a compromise. So let me close with two things. First of all, from Whitman. Walt Whitman is the great poet of America, in my opinion. I'll just do two quick bits. This is his poem in 1865, written at one of the worst moments in American history, called When I Heard the Learned Astronomer. And this is what I would urge us in the 21st century. This is how I would urge us to see the world. Whitman writes, "When I heard the learned astronomer, when the proofs, the figures were ranged in columns before me, when I was shown the charts and diagrams to add, divide, and measure them, when I sitting heard the astronomer where he lectured with much applause in the lecture room, how soon unaccountable I became tired and sick, till rising and gliding out I wandered off by myself into the mystical moist night air, and from time to time looked up in perfect silence at the stars." Isn't that a great poem? And here's another bit from Whitman. If we're going to do soul work in the 21st century, we're going to need to take the risk of loving again. I think the family and marriage and romance are in deep disarray at the end of the 20th century. And that people are frightened of love because of the risks, both physical and spiritual, and that what we're going to have to do is find new courage to reach out and take the risk of love. It's going to be very, very difficult. But Whitman says in the middle of Song of Myself, I think the most beautiful line of poetry ever written in America. He says, "Stop this day and night with me, and I will show you the beginning of all poems." Stop this day and night with me, and I will show you the beginning of all poems. Somehow in the next century, we're going to have to move away from the worldview that we have and into a worldview of poetry and love and eros and romance, including a romance with the land. And finally, then, let me close with the last paragraph of Walden. Here would be my advice to you, if you want advice, as we prepare for the millennium. If there's only one thing you could do between now and this time next year, I would urge you to read Thoreau's Walden. I think Walden is as great a text for the very message that I'm trying to suggest of the dead end of Western civilization that we're in, and the renewal that is quite possible if we will only wake up. I think that's the key text. And if you read this book, it's filled with wonders. Every time I read it at least once a year, sometimes twice and three times. Every time I read it, it's new to me in a way that no other book is. This is how he closes. "The life in us is like the water in a river. It may rise this year higher than man has ever known it before and flood the parched uplands. Even this may be the eventual year which will drown out all our muskrats. It was not always dry land where we dwell. I see far inland the banks which the stream anciently washed before science began to record its floods. Every one has heard the story which has gone the rounds of New England of a strong and beautiful bug which came out of the dry leaf of an old table of apple tree wood, which had stood in a farmer's kitchen for 60 years, that table, first in Connecticut and afterwards in Massachusetts, from an egg deposited in the living tree many years earlier still." So you have this table and a bug has come out of it. First in Connecticut, afterwards in Massachusetts, from an egg deposited in the living tree many years earlier still, as appeared by counting the annual layers beyond it. which was heard, this bug, gnawing out of the table for several weeks, hatched perchance by the heat of an urn? Who does not feel his faith in a resurrection and immortality strengthened by hearing of this story? Who knows what beautiful and winged life, whose egg has been buried for ages under many concentric layers of woodiness in this dead life of society, deposited at first in the alburnum of the green and living tree, which has been gradually converted into the into the semblance of its well-seasoned tomb, heard perchance gnawing out now for years by the astonished family of man as they sat round the festive board. That bug may unexpectedly come forth from amidst society's most trivial furniture to enjoy its perfect summer life at last. Thoreau says, I do not say that John or Jonathan will realize all of this, but such is the character of that morrow which mere lapse of time can never make to dawn. The light which puts out our eyes is darkness to us. Only that day dawns to which we are awake. There is more day to dawn. The sun is but a morning star. My suggestion to us all as we move into the millennium is that we wake up. Thank you. We're out of time. We do? We have time?
Thank you very much, Dr. Jenkinson. I can see from your speech why we continue to have you back. A number of people are going to class, and you feel free to do that. Dr. Jenkinson has some time before the next engagement on campus, and he's generous with his time. I'm going to also excuse myself for a meeting, and he'll preside and answer your questions. And Dr. Jenkinson, you use your judgment when you want to cut it off. But take this opportunity to hear the wisdom of Dr. Jenkinson. Again, we're so delighted he's here.
I'm sorry I went on and on. I will talk for another 10, 12 minutes if you want, if anyone has a question. Go ahead, sir. The current situation in the Balkans. Let me just say I'm not an expert in any of these areas, but I would say this. I've read the history of the 20th century now in 4 or 5 different volumes. One of the nice things about the end of the century and the end of the millennium is that there are all sorts of volumes being produced about this, and it's interesting that the century begins and ends with post-colonial wars. The century begins in 1900 with the Boer War, which is the first late colonial, post-colonial war of the century. And the 20th century has largely been the end of the colonial period in European history. And the end of the century will apparently close with the war in the Balkans, first in Bosnia and now in Kosovo. In a sense, even the war in Iraq belongs to the same category, that the world was artificially carved up in the 18th and 19th centuries by the great European colonial powers. And the history of the 20th century is the undoing of all of that. Iraq is an artificial creature. Certainly Kuwait is an artificial creature. Israel is artificial. The way that Yugoslavia was fashioned out of the Austro-Hungarian Empire at the beginning of the century after World War I is artificial. And when these highly artificial nation-states cease to be centrally controlled by strong men like Tito or by the Cold War communist regime of the Soviet Union, their unnaturalness, the very artificiality of them begins to be glaring, and they almost always break down into civil war. And so what's happening in the former Yugoslavia is almost the inevitable working out of bad energies that are lingering from the colonial hegemony of the Western powers and from the artificial way that the world was carved up into nation states at the end of World War I at the Treaty of Versailles. And my sense is, as a humanities scholar, I don't know the first thing about geopolitics, but my sense is that you build up that kind of bad energy as you fill a capacitor with energy, and eventually it has to be released. And when it's released, it's almost always spasmodic. Jefferson said that when Lafayette wrote to him complaining about the French Revolution and the Reign of Terror, Jefferson wrote back a kind of snotty letter to Lafayette saying, "Did you expect to be transported from despotism to liberty on a feather bed?" I think Jefferson would say, well, you do this dumb stuff by carving up the world in this way, and when the people reassert themselves, their natural antagonisms to that system will shed itself in blood, and that there are deep, deep tribal and ethnic identities and hatreds which we have no choice but to recognize. You can do one of two things. You can either recognize them and try to educate, which would be Jefferson's solution, or you can create colonial empires of the kind that Versailles created and then have strong men to reign over them in perpetuity. But your choice is either to have a despotic regime to control these passions or to acknowledge them and to try to weaken their strength by education and by cooperation. And so I think it's fair to say that what's happening in Kosovo is much more complicated than any American State Department could ever understand. Any other thoughts? Back here, yes. Well, that's a good question. How are we going to choose our mates? This is, of course, a perennial problem of culture, and there's no useful answer to this problem. My psychotherapist in Reno, Nevada, a brilliant woman, says that the romantic paradigm that we live under, where people actually meet at a bowling alley and fall head over heels in love and then within months throw their lives together, that is a disastrous pattern, she says, and that it's a mistake that the West made beginning in the Romantic period. And she says almost any other system, from arranged marriages to lifelong friendships, is superior to this failed approach that we have taken. I don't know whether I believe that myself. I think I don't believe that, but I do believe that we have to become more mature about eros and love in the next century. Maybe not next century. We'll probably muddle through in the usual way, but at some point we're going to have to get more serious about it, and it's going to take several forms. First of all, we're going to have to mate on a different level. It seems to me that what's happened, I won't go into too much detail about this, although it's actually one of my favorite subjects. I think what Western civilization has done is narrow the concept of maleness almost to zero. And so here's a man, take a son, a boy named Patrick. He's 10 years old. He's a whole human soul. But what his culture, what his peers are doing, are narrowing him if they can, until he has a less poetic vocabulary, till he reads less, till he would never be caught doing something that might appear to be effeminate, till he distances himself from girls and from his mother, till he begins to be aggressive, and he keeps being reinforced for all of that narrowing, and he's almost never given disincentives for that kind of narrowing. I have a young friend who lives in Reno, Nevada, who's an athlete, a star athlete, a kind of big man on campus. He went on a 5-hour bus ride from one end of the state to the other, and he was caught by his baseball peers reading a book. And they said incredibly derogatory things about his basic sexual identity for reading a book. Now, he was a man of strength. He has an incredible mother, and so he toughed it out and took that criticism, but that was a disincentive for him to read next time on that bus trip. And I think what's happened is that our concept of maleness has been narrowed so breathtakingly that men have really become, on the whole, pitiful creatures. And that means they don't bring much to the table. And what we need to do is widen this concept. I think Thomas Jefferson is a beautiful example of that, of a man who was an alive human being in every possible regard, from interior decorator on the one hand to terrorist on the other. I think we need to embrace more maleness, a wider concept of maleness, and when we do, it'll be easier for women to love us. But at the moment, I can't imagine why they do. I think women need some work too, but that's another question, and I'm certainly not qualified to suggest what that might be, but I do think that what we need to do is if we widen the concept of eros to include friendship and benevolence and sensitivity and gratitude and hugging and attention, good listening, generosity of spirit, quietness, then I think sexuality, male sexuality, would cease to be such a kind of rampant anarchic force. And mating would work a lot better. But I do honestly think that one of the most significant problems of mating in our own time is the pathetic caricature that men are of what they might be if they were brought up in a more sensitive culture. Yes?
I recognize what you said about Thoreau and Whitman, but would you comment upon prospective education in the next century from an organizational standpoint?
Well, I know that for one, it's a question, what about education from an organizational standpoint? Again, let me just say that your questions are all wonderful questions. Unfortunately, I have no answers to them because what do I know about education? I can only speculate as somebody who's fascinated by it, but I don't pretend to know the answer to this question. I do think this. I think the factory model of education has to end. And I see what's going in just the wrong direction with this, towards more testing, towards more of a factory code, more of a Hamiltonian system. I was in Arizona the other night giving a talk, and there was the head of the Arizona School Boards Association. She stood before this group of 300 futurists, and she said, here's what education needs to be for the next century. We need to create good workers. And I wanted to stand up and scream and said, we got enough good workers in America. How about some souls? How about some poets? How about some people who know how to think? How about some skeptics? How about some people who are artists? How about people who are critical of work, or who know how to put work in its place, or have balance in their life? But do we need any more emphasis on good work? I think we've got that. The Puritan work ethic is running so deeply in American culture that you can almost never wrestle anyone into leisure. And so I don't think that's the answer, and I don't think the factory model of education is working. I know there are homeschoolers in this community, and I have respect for them. I don't think that's the model either. I think we need mentoring. All of you who are, I'll bet every one of you in this room can think of a mentor. I can think of mine. I could tell you long stories about him. But I think every young mind at some point begins to bloom. That's the most critical moment in any young person's life. And if there is a mentor there to nurture that young mind and to put books in front of it and to ask questions and really wait for the answers and to guide without tyranny and to show authority without domineering and not to have a sexual agenda of any sort, not to exploit in any way, which all too often happens. If there is a mentor present at the blossoming of that young mind, the chance of a flourishing human being is huge. And if that mentor is absent or if that mentor is corrupt, then the chance of that young mind blossoming into real fruit is limited. I think that's the issue. And so if we're going to have a mentoring model or a community model, then we need to, I think, radically redefine what education is and stop thinking of it as proficiency in a certain body of knowledge that can be taught by someone standing in front of a whole group of people and delivering. I think it's going to have to be much more organic, much more communitarian than that. And I can see it happening. I just don't think we have the will to do it. But if we had the will to do it, I mean, if you gave me $1 billion and said, Professor, design an educational system that will work, I promise you I could do it. I certainly could do one that works better. But anyone could. And so here's the question Jefferson would ask. When you look at our educational system, when you look at our healthcare delivery system, when you look at our politics, if you look at the way we elect presidents, if you look at our transport systems, if you look at everything, every institution, line them all up, everything that we do in our lives, look at them. Why do we continue to cling to them when it's so obviously the case that they no longer are working for us? Wouldn't a truly enlightened people say, that one's not working, let's fix it. That one's not working, let's scrap it. So it seems to me that what we need is a much more one-on-one or 1 in 5 group circle kind of activity, a project learning kind of model of education. Other countries are doing it. I think we should look to the German model. I think we should look to the Japanese model. I think we should look at some really radical systems. I'll just quickly tell you about one. There's a college near Bishop, California, called Deep Springs College. It's a true anarchy. The students come there. They choose their courses. They hire the faculty. They set the rules. So I went to visit it. It's a great place. It's in the middle of nowhere, which helps for an anarchy. You know, you don't want anarchy in Santa Fe or in Los Angeles or Cincinnati, but anarchy in the desert works. And the dean was there. He's living on good behavior. He can be fired at any time by this motley crew of 40 boys. And the dean said, here's how it works. They come here, and for the first 7 months, all hell breaks loose, and it's total chaos here. Nothing happens. They don't study. They drink all the time. They're lazy. Their rooms are a mess. The whole system begins to collapse. And then one day, in about April of their first year here, they wake up, and they shake it off and think, this can't be what we came here for. And then the students start to reassert order. But they do it voluntarily, and they do it because they want it. And suddenly they've caught up. They're up to speed in calculus. They're up to speed in German. They're up to speed in all that they're trying to do. It's a great model. Obviously, it's not one you can use in every town in America, but all I'm saying is that there is a breathtaking range of possibilities, and it's a pitiful culture that just clings to one because that's the way we have it and it's fundable. And so I would suggest that we find the most creative people in every community and say, what would you like to do about education? And see what comes out of their mouths. I'll take a couple quick more questions. Yes? For Pine Ridge? Well, here's what you can do. You can call your Congress people, and you can write your president, and you can say, you know what, it's time for us to do some justice on the Indian question. I have a whole range of suggestions. This is one of my areas of deep fascination, but I think, for example, that, and some of you will disagree with this, it's fine. First of all, we should have great encouragement for cultural renaissance on all Indian reservations. Language programs, language radio, traditional craft work. We should honor that cultural tradition and restore it to the extent we can with virtually unlimited funding. Unlimited funding means almost nothing because we're talking about relatively small populations. Dictionaries of Hidatsa, dictionaries of Sioux, of Cheyenne, of Coeur d'Alene, and so on. We should have unlimited scholarships for any young Native American who wants to go to college anywhere. And it's not just enough to say we'll pay for it, then we have to find the network that will keep them there, that will nurture them when they're there and find true communities. We have to do enterprise zones on the reservations, and casinos are not going to be enough. But further than that, I think there has to be reparation. This is more radical, but I think we should begin with an immediate two-tiered policy. Number one, we should try to eliminate checkerboarding. Checkerboarding is the system whereby every other square or 5 out of 6 squares of land on a reservation are owned by white people. I would create trust funds so that when that white family was willing to sell, or when the family died, that land could be repurchased in trust for the tribe, and I would restore the territorial integrity of the reservations, which after all are on the whole the spoil lands of America. And then I would immediately add 10%. I would add a 10% immediate surcharge to the reservations to show good faith, and so on and so forth. I could go on endlessly, but I would also suggest bilingual education in Indian country. I see no reason why, when I grew up in North Dakota in the 1960s, I should not have learned a good deal about the Sioux, the Cheyenne, the Arikara, the Hidatsa, the Mandan, and possibly even have taken some preliminary language courses in these cultures. So a lot could be done, but number one is you've got to make sure these people are fed and clothed and that they have the best possible health care systems in the world. I'll tell you one quick story. I was at a sweat ceremony in Helena, same trip that I was on, and I was at the first sweat lodge, and there was a wonderful Native American man who led me through it. And one of the other people that was in the sweat with me was a young Indian boy. He may have been 20 years old. He was married. He had just come out of drug and alcohol rehabilitation, and it seemed clear to me that he wasn't going to make it. It seemed clear to me that addiction and degradation were going to be the permanent habit of his life without some act of grace. And moreover, he was clearly biologically the victim of fetal alcohol syndrome. So now he is mentally retarded, incapacitated for life by his mother's inability to get clear of drugs and alcohol. It looks to me like he's passing it on. World without end, amen. Here's the question I would just ask. Do you think that any mother in the world would, by choice, poison her fetus for life? The answer is no, of course. I mean, maybe there are a few exceptions, but this is a culture of desperation, not a culture of choice. And we have to, as people who are in many regards responsible for what happened, we have to come in with a lot of benevolence and tolerance and patience and money, and try to create an intervention system that can stop that cycle from continuing. And it seems to me that if you added up all the costs of this, that it would be pennies in our budget, and that we should just do it and get it over with, and so on and so forth. Last question for them. Yes, sir. Now I know why it's so much easier to be Thomas Jefferson, because he has an answer to this and an answer to that. I don't know the answer to this question, but I'll tell you a great book to read about it, which is always the humanist's answer to everything. Walden is the book I recommend. If you love Tony Stewart and love popcorn forums, or even like me a little, you will go out and buy Walden and read it. If you haven't read it for years, you'll reread it. It is maybe the greatest book ever written in America. Certainly one of the great books ever written on earth. And it's just full of how to do this. It tells you everything you need to know. It tells you how to wake up. It tells you how to see the world fresh. It tells you how to simplify your life. It tells you how to discriminate between luxury and necessity. And I know of no book. This is the ultimate how-to book. If you read this book and take it and internalize it, your life will be better. It certainly has been for me. And I would love to come back and just lead a seminar on Walden. It's just glorious. But at any rate, the other book that I would recommend is a much less good book after that. You know, what could one say? But it's by Jerry Mander, called In the Absence of the Sacred. And it's about the loss of the sacred in the world. And he has a really amazing, sad story. The Canadian government, which is on the whole a more benevolent government than ours, decided that there were some tribal peoples in the Arctic region of the Northwest Territories who were deprived. And so they decided to give them satellite TV, which would not be one's first choice, but that's what they decided to do, because that would be, educational programs could be beamed in, and Canadian C-SPAN and so on and so forth. And the tribe kept saying no. So they would say, we'll come in, we'll set up the whole system, we'll give you all sorts of TV receivers and public spaces and Quonsets to view them in, and we'll subsidize it, and we'll do some local programming, it'll be great. And the tribe kept saying no. Well, finally the Canadian government put the squeeze on the tribe and forced them to accept this system. Within 6 months, and this is not an exaggeration, at least if Jerry Mander is telling the truth, within 6 months, the local culture had effectively collapsed and everyone was watching reruns of Laverne and Shirley. It's just like in 1 6-month period, the culture just collapsed by TV, because TV is the ultimate drug, and they had no way of resisting it. And Jerry Mander's view is, how dare the Canadian government interfere in this little village, thinking that they was doing good. That's the tragedy, thinking that it was doing them a favor. I think the number one answer to parenting is you shut the television set off and probably give it away. My dearest friend has 2 children. They are extraordinary young people, and they are extraordinary because they watch no television. They're reading the Odyssey. They ask interesting questions. They are polite. They are civil. They're decent. They're self-starters. Why? I mean, she's a terrific mother, and, you know, there's something to that. But it's also that this family has structured its life in a soul-affirming way, not a soul-denying one. And I have other friends that I like greatly, but they just let their children run rampant through the world of television, and you can just see the difference. It's the difference between a family that works and a family that doesn't work. That's one thing. Plus, this friend of mine also has fashioned her professional life, which is a highly ambitious one, so that she can be in the house for her children every day. In other words, she has a value higher than the third car garage. And because she made that choice, she has been in some little way marginalized professionally, but not significantly, not enough to make that a bad bargain. I think we have to start doing that. And here's my advice. I have a 4-year-old. I'm a divorced parent. Alas, I consider every divorce a failure in some regards. But when my daughter was born, I said to myself this: I will always say yes unless I have a compelling reason to say no. And if you will let that be your motto with children, I will always say yes unless I have a compelling reason to say no. And as a corollary to that, I said, if she wants me to get on the floor and do a project, however tired I am, I'm going to force myself to get on the floor and do the project, because she's only going to be around for X number of years, and then she's going to be something else. And I'm going to long for the days when we were on the floor picking up glitter. So I do that, and it pays off. I can just see it. I can see her soul appreciative of an adult who's willing to get on the floor. And my last piece of advice is never talk down to children. They are adults in little packages. And if you talk to them as adults in little packages, I don't guarantee that things will go well, but they certainly have a better chance of going well than if you do the reverse of all of those things. So what do I know about anything that I have said today? I'll see you all at 1 o'clock with scholars. Take care.